Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I've introduced myself, Tim Evans. I am a banker. I always feel a little intimidated coming to ESG events and talking about climate change because I feel much more comfortable in the economic and business space. But I have a young and enthusiastic team at HSBC Vietnam, and I am therefore encouraged to come and tell the story. So thank you, Trang, for always volunteering me to do these things. I start with a warning. I am not a fortune teller. And I've been asked, including yesterday, please forecast what the future is for the Vietnamese economy, what is going to happen with the tariffs, what's going to happen with the Vietnamese dong, where interest rates are going, what is the balance of payments impact to Vietnam. On a relative basis, does Vietnam win or lose? I'm sorry, if I knew that, I wouldn't be here. I'd probably be in Macau or Vegas. So I am not a fortune teller. I will tell you what I know, what I'm hearing from my customers, what we're hearing from our research teams. But unfortunately, we do live in incredible volatile times. And we've seen how things have moved around very rapidly, even in the last 48 hours. What looked like an impasse between the US and China, we're starting to potentially see some green shoots of opportunity, or at least they're entering into a dialogue. So it is volatile. That is driving a lot of the decision-making that's happening across our planet at the moment. You only need to pick up a newspaper, switch on CNBC, MSN, CNN, go on any internet channel, and you will see the level of volatility. Just to give you an order of magnitude, and I know you're not bankers, but bear with me on this one. 10 years ago, the US was able to raise debt at 2%. This year, the US has to refinance $9 trillion of debt, and that price is around 4.3%. That shows you the risk premium just on the United States. That shows how volatile a world we are living in. We also see significant geopolitical tensions. We have the ongoing war taking place in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine. We see continued tensions in Gaza. We saw a recent military spat between India and Pakistan. Geopolitically, the world is far from stable. And there's the ongoing economic uncertainty. Every customer we speak to is suspending CapEx until they get very clear view of what the future looks like. And that CapEx is in their existing operations, but it also impacts where they're going to invest from an ESG perspective. Companies like certainty. And when it's uncertain, it's unlikely that you will put significant investment, whether it is in the ESG space or in your core business. And we all know what happened on the 2nd of April. Apparently it was Liberation Day. Some would argue it would be called something else, but the impact that that has had on the Vietnamese economy, the global economy, has been second to none. Now, hopefully we're coming out of that stage, but that basically put the world economy into a form of mild cardiac arrest for a couple of weeks. At least until April the 11th, when they said, actually, there's a 90-day suspension, then the electronics don't count. But that uncertainty certainly doesn't help the corporate sector. The reality is global warming is not sitting around and saying, okay, guys, I get it. I'll wait until you get your stuff together. The reality is global warming is happening every single day. We do not have the luxury to sit around and wait and say, okay, well, let's get through all this internal turbulence that we've created in the global economy ourselves and then start addressing climate change. It is just as important today as it was yesterday. And anyone who was around on Friday evening, Saturday morning in Ho Chi Minh City, these were photos that were taken in this city within the last week, have seen the level of flooding. Ho Chi Minh sees heaviest rainfall in 8 years, traffic lights toppled. That is the reality of climate change. I have a friend who lost his house in California last year because of the fires. That was based on climate change. You look at droughts in Africa, you look at droughts across the Middle East, all driven by climate change. And all of this has a cost. If you do nothing, there is a cost associated with the impact that you see from climate change. So at HSBC, and this is not a cheap plug, but we remain committed to supporting ESG. We're a global bank, we operate in over 60 countries, and the reason we do it is fundamentally it's the right thing to do. This is not a marketing activity. This is not something you do because there's a short-term policy by the government and then you suddenly say, I'm not going to do it in the future. I have 2 young children who will challenge me at least 3 or 4 times a week as to what are you doing in the ESG space? Why don't we have an EV daddy? Why don't you cycle like Daniel does instead of going on the scooter? It helps that he's my neighbor. But I'm also getting this from my staff. The average age of the team in Vietnam is under 29 years old. HR keen to point out that when I'm not in the mathematical equation, it's even lower than that. They are asking, what is our company doing in this space? I want to work for an organization that is committed to addressing this issue. And as Daniel said, if you look at what happens in Hoi An or Phan Thiet, the beach is receding. This country is one of the top 5 countries, according to the World Bank, that's being impacted by climate change. So you cannot sit back and say, I will participate, I won't participate. If you're in ESG, you're in. If you're not, stay out. But this in-out doesn't help. So we are committed. The world is warming. I think over the last 100 years, we've added something like 1.2% centigrade in heat. That is ongoing. We've lost something like 20% of the Arctic cap. The reality is that heat isn't uniform across the world, so it's actually more impactful at the poles than it is at the rest. Our planet is warming up. And I looked, so I joined HSBC in 1993, so everyone can kind of roughly figure out my age. In that period of time, water has raised 20 centimeters globally in the last 30 years. Well, according to ChatGPT, so I can take it as gospel, but anyway, they were the numbers that I saw in the car this morning. So it's happening. And just like the saying is, the longer you stay on the wrong train, the more expensive it is to get back. The longer we wait to address climate change, the more expensive it gets. And trust me, it's not cheap at the moment. It's hugely expensive. Now, the rough indication is that by 2050, the world needs to spend roughly $200 trillion. Global GDP is roughly $100 trillion. So the world has to spend 2 times GDP, roughly, to get to net zero by 2050. That is a massive number. The annual spend on military all over the world is roughly $2 trillion. So even if you gave up military spend entirely across the world, you wouldn't be able to get to the number that you need to finance the global transition to net zero. So Vietnam, what does Vietnam need by 2040? There's some numbers are being thrown out there. 400 billion is a number we hear often. If you speak to Bloomberg New Economy, so we commissioned them to do a review of the Vietnamese economy and to design what are the key pathways that Vietnam needs to follow to be able to get to net zero. Their independent view was it is around $46 billion a year. That's roughly 10% GDP, slightly less. But it's a significant number. PDP-8, if you look at that, their view is that Vietnam needs to spend $835 billion by 2050. 2 years GDP, which is kind of similar to what the global trend is. So Vietnam is kind of aligned. Either way, this is a massive number. And how do we get that? We're going to have to make compromises. You cannot rely on the public sector to do it entirely. You cannot rely on the private sector to do it entirely. We as a species need to come together and figure out how to finance this. So let's look at Vietnam. Vietnam by 2050 has committed to transition to net zero. That was an incredibly bold statement made at COP26. It's ahead of China, it's ahead of India, it's ahead of Indonesia. Vietnam went out there on a limb to do this. Now, partly it's because it is the right thing to do for this country. Partly, if you look at the FDI coming into this country, a lot of it requires to be able to be provided with sustainable finance going forward, a sustainable renewable energy going forward. The commitment of Vietnam is 75% power generation to be renewable by 2050. That'll be one of the leading countries globally, certainly when you look at it through the lens of a frontier or emerging market, whatever status it will be at that stage. So how do we get there? It's easy to have this ambition, it's easy to calculate the funding, but how? How does Vietnam get there? Well, clearly one sector is renewable energy. The benefit that Vietnam has is it's one of the top 5 countries globally that has the capability to do renewable energy, whether it's nearshore, farshore wind, whether it's hydroelectric, whether it's geothermal, solar. Vietnam has that sort of natural ability to actively play in this space. there has to be investment in the smart grid. There's no good having all of this capability, whether it's offshore, onshore, hydro, but you can't pump it into the grid and you can't transport it around the country. Now, I'm not an infrastructure engineer, I'm not a utility specialist, but I've been told that Vietnam has 3 separate grids and that most of the renewable energy is kind of featured in the south, and a lot of the consumption is based either here or in the Hanoi area where you get a lot of the tech companies coming in and Haiphong. The ability to be able to transport that effectively and cheaply across the country is critical. So there has to be significant investment in the smart grid. And at the moment, this is run by EVN, which is a big state-owned company. They have their own funding challenges because they're heavily indebted and heavily geared. Green transportation. So we're starting to see it. EV scooters, you're starting to see green buses, you're starting to see EVs. I started my career 30 years ago in Hong Kong, and I used to go across the border to Shenzhen and Guangzhou regularly, and those cities were polluted beyond recognition. If you go today, there is still pollution, don't get me wrong, but the number of EVs and public transport infrastructure is second to none. And that is within a 30-year career. So if we look at the EV market, just to give you an order of magnitude, in Vietnam, it should be worth roughly $12 billion in the next 8 years. And that should have, hopefully, a material impact on the breathability in some of the key cities. There is also the ongoing public development of public transport. So we've seen that in Ho Chi Minh. I mean, the long-awaited metro is open, which Van was able to use this morning. I've used it once, so I can actually take the moral high ground. I have actually been on it, and it was actually surprisingly good. But clearly, there is that ongoing investment in that space. The government is looking at a carbon trading platform, so they should pilot launch it this year and hopefully be fully operational by 2029, which again is a leading position if you certainly look at Vietnam through the lens of a frontier or emerging market. But the big question is, there has to be public and private support. To give you an order of magnitude, the total amount of debt in the banking system in Vietnam is around 110, 115% of GDP. So if you assume GDP is 500 billion for the sake of the maths, there's around 550 billion total bank debt. Even if every single loan being given by every single bank in Vietnam went to this space, we probably still wouldn't have enough. So we do need the private sector and private banks to be involved in this as well. So public investment from the government budget this year totally is around $34 billion. Now, Vietnam is the only country in ASEAN, or the country in ASEAN that has the biggest fiscal capability because debt to GDP is roughly 37%. So it does have the ability, should it want, to spend more from its public debt. And we're hopefully seeing that as the Vietnamese government is looking to spend more on infrastructure. But even if Vietnam goes up to 65% of GDP, which is its threshold, there's still not enough to be able to fund the transition to net zero. So there just isn't enough. They are going to have to tap into different liquidity pools, some of them in-country, but a lot of them outside. And as they say, every problem has 2 solutions. You can either run away from it or you participate. And I think Vietnam is participating in the challenge of net zero. The runaway option is not there. The reality, the runaway option isn't there for all of us. You cannot have Vietnam doing ESG and other countries saying, I don't care, I'll still use coal and I will. The reality is we're all in this together. And it will need a concerted effort by humanity to be involved in this. And that is, the sad part is that certain political movements are pro, anti, drill, don't drill. It doesn't help. It certainly doesn't help when most of this investment is long-term. It's not short-term investment that has to come into this space. So you look, if you enter ESG, this is what you come up with in the word cloud: finance, financing, banks, income, companies, interest. It comes down to how we're going to fund this. Now, the reason I want to say this is that there are a number of projects that if a bank looked at it, they'd say, it's just too risky for me. And the way to get around that is there are institutions that have a different risk appetite from banks that are prepared to step in and say, I will partner with you because I will take the riskiest part of that transaction so that you can come in. So HSBC, let's see if the back button works, it does. So cheap plug here. So Pentagreen is a joint venture that we have set up with Temasek out of Singapore. This is a sovereign wealth fund of Singapore, together with HSBC, and we call it catalytic finance. This entity, and we've done transactions in Vietnam, will come in to transactions where a bank says, I would do it, but only if that part of the risk was covered. And they have come in and done a number of transactions in Vietnam, but across the region, so that the banks can get comfortable with the transactions. Now, a lot of these transactions are 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year money. Working capital is 90 days, 180 days. This is long-term finance, and for banks to get comfortable with that, they need some certainty, and they do like the fact when these sort of institutions come in. So thank you, Temasek, for joining us in this, but Temasek realizes that this is clearly an area where you can marshal additional funds in. So what can the government do? I think it needs to create a positive environment. I think the Vietnamese have certainly done a lot better than other markets, but it needs to continue to work in that space. It needs to attract foreign investment. The Vietnamese cannot do it alone. Now, this country has an incredible ability to attract foreign direct investment. Has done, continues to do so, even with the challenges that we're facing at the moment. So registered FDI can be anywhere between $25 and $35 billion a year. Vietnam has to be able to attract foreign direct investment that goes into the renewable space. It's already one of the leading markets in ASEAN in that space, but it has that capability, and it needs to replicate that more to attract more foreign direct investment, certainly into the renewable space. There needs to be a detailed taxonomy. Everyone needs to know that when you say A, you mean A, and when you say X, you mean X, because then we're all talking about the same thing. And there needs to be a little bit more work done on this so that everyone knows when you say what you're saying, people understand what you're saying. There has to be greater clarity around regulations. I've been in Vietnam for 5 years. Every time I renew my TRC card, it's a slightly different process. Every time my organization has a tax audit, it's slightly different. Every time I've engaged in any form of process with the government, it has been slightly different. And I understand why that is, but if you have greater clarity around regulations, you certainly improve the ease of doing business. And as a result of that, you will attract more funding. And finally, ESG disclosures. This isn't at an advanced stage in Vietnam, and if companies want to do ESG disclosures, there should be a third-party verification that people can stand by, because that will bring investors in. You no longer run the risk of greenwashing. Innovation, this country is hugely innovative. I'm hopeful that somewhere in garages in whether it's Silicon Valley or Haiphong, people are thinking about innovation, because this will be a key area which helps drive. Policy support, we're starting to see it from the regulators. I think we need a little bit more. Partnerships, it's going to be between banks, corporates, individuals, governments across the world. And as I say, every journey begins with a single step. So I now have my last slide, which is the most important one, because it will keep my legal and compliance team happy. I'd like Daniel to read it and be very careful, but there you are. There's a disclaimer that everything I've said can't be held against me, but thank you very much.